everybody. My name is Spencer Walsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have a good one for you, as always, on the show today. The latest on all things ceasefire negotiations, which are definitely heating up, especially with Israel really reeling after the 6 murdered hostages have come back to the country, and all of the shockwaves that had both here in America and throughout the world and within Israel itself. A lot of protests going on. Netanyahu under some increased pressure from surprising sources to get to a ceasefire deal, but he seems to be as recalcitrant as ever as Hamas makes a new statement. We'll cover the whole thing for you from every angle. Also, taking a look at what a Kamala Harris team on the Middle East may look like as U.S. universities are gearing up for the start of a new year. We'll take a look at some of the really incredible efforts that they have put to try and stop at the head, nip in the bud, whatever the expression is you want to use, some of these upcoming protests that are sure to be percolating, and hopefully they're going to come back prepared. We'll see how the protesters rally to that. We got a good one for you, as always, so we do thank you so much for joining us today. So we got to get to this Netanyahu news conference, that is for sure. But before we do, just want to give a quick shout out to the Supporters Club, and actually have a new little clip for this. Hello, everyone. Just wanted to take a quick minute to take a break from the proceedings, and thank you so much for listening to the News Flash podcast. I really love doing this podcast, and if you get as much of a kick listening to this podcast as I do making it, if it really does add something to your life, please consider joining the Supporters Club. It's about $5 a month, and you get ad-free versions of the episodes. Not only that, but we will be working towards Supporters Club only exclusive episodes where I break down, take a step back, break down some, more interesting long-form topics that we won't get a chance to discuss with the daily news cycle on News Flash. A little bit of a News Flash plus. Some of the biggest moments in history and politics and stuff that just wouldn't fit into the normal shows, but still super interesting and important. So many big plans for the Supporters Club, so please consider joining it. Thank you so much, and back to the show. All right, so we do have to take you to Israel, to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever, but Netanyahu did this news conference today. So this is how he essentially justified what was going to be a very, essentially a recommitment to the area and essentially not giving back on any of his demands. And essentially the big deal was a ceasefire. So there's several notable parts on this. First, let's take a listen to a bit of a clip from the exchange, I guess you could say, with this press conference today that was going down. And a lot of people were pointing to a very specific map. And that map that a lot of people are pointing to essentially does not include the West Bank. And it shows you that they are really setting up. And what a lot of people have been drawing alarm to is that with this the longest West Bank incursion in 20 plus years, by the Israeli army, they're setting up for some much bigger plans. They're really trying to ratchet up the settlements, and this is really an effort to kind of preserve the power of the Netanyahu administration and essentially going around causing trouble, causing conflict, and essentially not really even going about in Israel's interest anymore. It still technically is in Israel's interest of, expanding their power, expanding the Jewish supremacist state as much as possible, but it's no longer, I would say, the most effective way to do it. Probably the most effective way for Israel would to kind of essentially play it off with some sort of negotiations going on while the hostages are exchanged, look like a partner who's wanting to come to the table, do the negotiations, not essentially trot all over what the U.S. wants you to do. And essentially, when the hostages are good, you kind of invent a reason. You say, oh, Hamas is surging again. And then you use that to try and do whatever you want to do, whether it's push all the Palestinians into Gaza Strip, as I've heard some tell of, try and annex the West Bank, or to try and continuously establish a broader security presence in Gaza. There is, I think it's very hard to imagine there being, if there is a ceasefire deal and some hostages are exchanged, like that does, even if all the hostages are exchanged, it may slow down the momentum a little bit, but Israel has never been one to, it's going to be hard for them to pick it back up if the exchange does go pretty well, because again, I think it's important to remind everybody that Hamas has agreed to a full exchange of hostages for a certain amount of Palestinian prisoners, and then to go forward essentially with a Biden plan, which also includes a full military withdrawal, essentially going to the point where, you go release the prisoner or the hostages in stages. You set up a long-term in terms of allowing Gazans to come back to their homes, allowing people to rebuild, allowing aid coming in exchange for releasing all the hostages. And potentially Hamas is even signaled openness to, a change in government, or at least having some sort of elections, which I think is quite remarkable. But what we have seen from they essentially agreed to that Biden framework Hamas has, but what Netanyahu has done is again really hold off over the Netzarim and Philadelphia corridors, so controlling Gaza's ability to connect with Egypt, whether that's going into or out of Egypt, because a lot of people, their families were partially split up. Some remained in Gaza while some were able to escape to Cairo. So that's going to be a potential point of interest for the Gazan people. Also, aid coming in is going to be incredibly important. There's obviously tons of trucks piled outside the border. And ever since the Israel government went to Rafah a few months back, that aid has really been cut off quite effectively by the Israeli government. So now they're in that kind of tough situation, but they're also want to control, and this is another one of Hamas's key demands in terms of allowing people to go up to the north. They want to control the Netzarim corridor, which essentially cuts Gaza into, kind of sideways, going kind of a latitudinally, kind of cutting Gaza in half north southwise, which is a big impact on the ability of the Gazan people to restart their lives, work through all these kind of awful destruction that they've had, see if they still have a house, see if that house is in essentially just riddled with unexploded munitions or whatever the hell it is that they have in there, really awful stuff. But that is something that has been systematically shut down by the by this government. So we do have, I do want to go to what Netanyahu actually had to say today, so you can hear from the man himself, and then we'll go into some more analysis.
I will not surrender to this pressure. I know how to withstand pressure, even greater pressures. And our people, our nation won't surrender to this pressure. Most of the people understand, and it doesn't matter what you see on the screens, on TV. And I say to Sinwar, forget about it. It's not going to happen. We need to stand united to insist on this vital interest. We must act together so that the other side understands, just like they understood about putting an end to the war. They need to understand that we're not going to give up on the crucial things. We do give in on other matters that aren't that crucial. I gave a lot of flexibility throughout the year, but anything that's crucial, we insist on. And once Hamas understands that, once they understand, there's going to be a deal. And once they understand that, we will ensure our existence and our future. Together we stand, together we fight, and together, God willing, we will win.
Yeah, so there he goes. Not too much in the way of specifics, because I think that'll highlight for him and for everybody watching how he has really moved away from just reasonableness on this, and a big way you can tell is President Biden issued a one-word rebuke of Netanyahu's unwillingness to yield to his conditions for ceasefire and hostage deal. Asked a series of questions by reporters about whether Israeli Prime Minister was doing enough for a deal to get the hostages back, he simply said no. And that is very, very telling because, and this is, again, kind of a supporting clip that is reported by CNN, who is a very, very closely tied to the Israeli government, specifically Jeremy Diamond, who has been essentially been shown around by the IDF and the Jerusalem government there. So that is very, very clear. But I do want to go to this CNN clip, which essentially breaks it down why Biden is saying these things and why there are people out in the streets today throughout Israel, which we have touched on a little bit, but we'll circle back on as well.
The Israeli Prime Minister has spent the last couple of days really walking away from some of the key parts of this deal, indicating that this will not lead to an end of the war, which was very much the way that President Biden tried to.
So again, a ceasefire will not lead to the end of the war. That's circle that, highlight that. That is key policy point number one. Hamas said this is Hamas and Biden have said we're going to try and end this war. Period. And I think if you see the desire for the Netzarim corridor, desire for the Philadelphia corridor, the essential desire of the Netanyahu camp to have Israeli troops in Gaza indefinitely, no matter what, is a really, really big problem, something the Palestinians are never going to agree to, and something that Biden's never going to really support, and also something that shows Israel's, I think, broader desires in the region quite clearly. But it is, again, it's a very key part, and something that, Hamas has agreed, Biden's agreed, and Biden here is saying he's for once putting the onus on Netanyahu for a ceasefire deal, and I think that is really indicative of how things have gone.
Frame the deal on Friday, and the Israeli Prime Minister is doing that for one key reason, and that's because two far-right members of his governing coalition have threatened to topple the government altogether if the Israeli Prime Minister moves forward with this deal. But at the same time, there are now new concerns, Wolf, inside the Israeli government, according to two sources who I spoke with, concerns that the Israeli Prime Minister is in fact undermining the very fabric of this deal and the way in which it's being sold to Hamas by the mediators, by focusing so much on the fact that he will not allow this to lead to an end of the war until all the conditions of this war are met, meaning the destruction of Hamas.
And we see, again, with that destruction of Hamas, as well as now the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor are a very, very big part of this. And that is the 6 hostages being murdered in the context of Hamas's major statement today. So this is from Abu Abaida. It says the Netanyahu's insistence on freeing captives through military pressure instead of reaching a deal means they will go back to their families in coffins. Their families have to choose between receiving them dead or alive. This is the spokesperson for Hamas. Netanyahu and the army are fully responsible for the death of captives after they intentionally hindered any prisoners deal. It said the statement from the Qassam brigades came shortly after Netanyahu said the 6 captives whose bodies were recovered from a tunnel in southern Gaza's Rafah area had been executed by Hamas. I asked for your forgiveness for not bringing them back alive, Netanyahu said during a televised news conference earlier on Monday as protests over the deaths continued for a second day in Israel. We were close, but we didn't succeed. Hamas will pay a very heavy price for this, he added. Senior Hamas official Izzat El-Reshek added that 6 captives were killed in Israeli airstrikes. And I guess, when all is said and done in terms of the factual accounting of this, it seems more likely that that'll be the most likely demise of these Israeli captives compared to Hamas shooting them ahead. But this is a clear thing. They're saying we tried to play ball. We agreed to Biden's terms. We agreed to give up the hostages. We agreed for a prisoner exchange. We agreed to end the war and all this. But we even potentially a change of government, but we cannot put up with this as the Israeli government continues to kill us on the day, commit horrific massacres day in and day out, and just refuse to even entertain taking troops out of the Gaza periphery entirely. So I think that is a very, very clear sign that this is not going to be in any way. Things have changed from the perspective of Hamas, and that they will, after the incident where 300 Palestinian civilians were killed for the rescuing of 4 hostages. They're simply saying now, enough is enough. We got to essentially just, if we see the army coming, just put a bullet on their head so that they, which is a really awful situation because those hostages, in my opinion, they didn't deserve to be there. Like they were wrapped up in something that they were not combatants in, and it's proven, it's a matter of factual record that, in October, they offered to send all the hostages back in exchange for not, invading Gaza, but Israel turned them down. So they have continued over time and time again, Hamas has, to try and, essentially barter these hostages for a better conditions for themselves, which Israel has said, we don't want better conditions for you guys. We want your destruction, and we're going to make sure we have troops in there to do it as long as possible, essentially upping the conditions, upping the terms on the Israeli side more and more, minute by minute, really. So it seems that for Netanyahu, the alternatives, which his personal and political and personal life, is more important than the lives of the Israeli captives, Eldar said, adding that a huge number of protesters, including the Israeli right and radical right, support the government, despite a large number of protests, the Israeli right and radical right who support the government have the upper hand. This is Akiva Eldar, Israeli political analyst. The government and the prime minister are now on the defensive, said Ori Goldberg, an expert in Israeli politics. This is about momentum now. So the Biden moment was definitely pretty interesting. But again, these words mean, they're helpful. It's like, finally, you may bring this up, but what are you going to do? What are you going to threaten behind the scenes? What more pressure are you going to put on behind the scenes to actually get this done and get Netanyahu to even go in line with, someone like Yoav Gallant, who's just like, let's wrap this business in Gaza up. Let's focus on other things, maybe on Lebanon. Let's get the hostages back, and then we can reevaluate. We have the opportunity here to get the hostages back, and, Netanyahu is not taking it in terms of, for total victory in terms of complete and increased destruction, and trying to avoid the political hit he'll take by ending the war and making a deal with Hamas. So Netanyahu and only his reluctance to engage in deal is what made this all happen, said Alon Pincus, who is a former Israeli ambassador and government advisor to Al Jazeera. So pretty much bottom line here is Netanyahu shows no signs of slowing down. Even as some of the hostage families call for him to make a deal, to agree to the U.S. terms of withdrawing Israeli troops, he refuses to do that, even as now Hamas says they will start killing hostages if the army comes close to rescuing them, and essentially saying they will go back to their families in coffins, which is obviously causing a huge amount of support for a ceasefire deal to surge in Israel. Netanyahu says no, total victory it is. And meanwhile, Biden and Kamala Harris over in the U.S. are slowly waking up to what is a very, very rude awakening. The ball from here on out is, as it always has been, in Biden and Harris's court. Will they force, along with some elements of the Israeli military, a deal on Netanyahu? Will they force him to essentially just stop the fighting for now, get the hostages back, get a deal done, or will they continue to let him kill and escalate and go on his murderous rampage? Because again, Palestinian lives are not human to them. I think it's always safer to go with the status quo. So it seems the second option will unfortunately be a bit more likely. Just wanted to go to a general update of things in the West Bank and kind of get you caught up on that, and also just general news. So we have a Palestinian man was killed by Israeli forces, was handed over, and was received by paramedics with torture marks found on his body. So this was in Jenin, as I think it's important to say, as Israel goes for their largest West Bank operation, especially in the northern parts, the kind of more resistance-heavy parts of Jenin, to try and cut off what they say is resistance, about to flourish. But they're not doing any kind of a targeted operation. They're not doing, any sort of, normal operation. They're calling for mass evacuations. They are destroying roads. They're destroying infrastructure and buildings, and they're also attacking hospitals, first aid trucks, and ambulances. Where have we seen this before? We've seen this before in Gaza, and it is a great strategy for them to kind of drive out all the infrastructure, make the place uninhabitable as possible, and then drive out people as well so they can move in and begin to settle the West Bank, just as we saw on that Netanyahu map that he showed in his press conference. You can see pictures of it online about, there's no West Bank, there's just Gaza, where all these Palestinians eventually get chased into, and Israeli troops essentially carve it up and monitor it until they can essentially, get them all out, is probably the broader, bigger plan, the broader idea there. So that is definitely very important to keep an eye on, very important to monitor as they continue to go through with this West Bank operation. How much infrastructure are they destroying? How much evacuate? How many people are evacuating? Are they being let back in? We're seeing constant videos of bulldozers destroying buildings, very similar to the way it was in Gaza, essentially to kind of pave that way, just like we saw with that map, for people to come in and for the West Bank essentially to be annexed, which is, as we know, is a pretty strongly held goal, I guess to say, of the Israeli right, and probably large chunks of the Israeli society, given that it is a far-right country in general, and they're certainly continuing on that path, pretty uninterrupted, I must say. 5 people, including a child, have been killed on Israeli airstrikes on Nuseirat and Jabalia refugee camps. That's in Gaza. Britain will suspend 30 out of 350 arms exports licenses it has with Israel in light of concerns that such equipment might be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. Israeli troops handed the body of a 58-year-old Palestinian man, Ayman Raja Abed, to Palestinian health authorities on Monday as torture in their prisons continue. And Israeli troops will remain in Philadelphia corridor on the south, Philadelphia corridor on the southern edge of the Gaza Strip, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Monday. As more epidemics continue in Gaza, hepatitis A is now running rampant. So definitely disturbing stuff, to say the least, on that last part with the continuing epidemics, but broader goals. It is a time of uncertainty right now between Netanyahu continuing to push for more and more destruction, more and more troops in the region. And again, I think the ball is in the court of the U.S. as kind of the Israeli supervisors here in this region. We have Israel as a client state. Will we let them continue to do what they do, continue to kill unadulterated, or will we force a ceasefire on their hands, force them to get their hostages back, which is what they claim to want? That is the moment of truth, I guess, for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And it can't be really a moment too soon, as more genocide and more destruction continues, not only now in Gaza, but also the West Bank. Well, it is that time, and people are heading back to school. That means college campuses are about to be alight with protests. And apparently schools have been busy, according to Monowest, this past summer to hear from consultants and prepare for a crackdown with no time to waste. As the assistant director of campus safety at Oberlin College reminded participants in a recent webinar, Navigating Campus Controversy, Challenges of Managing Protests and Critical Events. If your students are gone now, this is a good time to tighten up your policies. Run by ex-military, law enforcement, and campus public safety officials, the risk and crisis management consulting industry constitutes a critical node of a larger repression of state actors, partisan off-campus groups, and the Zionist lobby, who collectively work to criminalize student political dissent. Risk management involves financial and non-financial risks, everything from regulatory compliance to campus safety. Institutional investors, driven by mandates for safe, predictable returns, encourage universities to adopt stringent risk management frameworks that prioritize financial stability and institutional reputation over intellectual integrity. In the era of the student intifada, pro-Palestinian student activism is regarded by stakeholders as posing risks severe enough to justify policies that reconfigure the boundaries of personal expression. And we're seeing some pretty crazy new policies and rules being set up, about, protest time, shouting time. We'll get into it all with this story, but I think it's always very telling. It's always very clear and important to remember that for these universities, people protesting a genocide going on, and mostly in pretty tame ways. There's obviously some exceptions that go up to the more aggressive level, but in terms of people just sitting there in the lawn, they're holding a visual. A lot of this stuff, that just in and of itself to these people poses a threat because so much of the funding we saw, Colombia had tons of examples of this when it was really closely scrutinized, are tied to people who are pro-Israel themselves, and they put pressure on the university to tamp down on the speech, and it's just generally seen as uncouth if you have all these, pro-Palestinian crazies running around, causing a lot of trouble for everyone. So, there goes free speech. And for a lot of these people, it's going to be the very same people defending this that were freaking out on free speech on college campuses a couple of years back. Since the current unrest is extremely challenging to navigate and will likely continue into the 2024-2025 academic year, this year's conference will solely cover protest successes and challenges. The conference's advisory board consists of current law enforcement officers like Bobby Brasher, whose biography boasts that he spent time in Israel observing Israeli strategies and tactics, a little chilling there, highlights this year's conference included surveillance technology, product demonstrations, tabletop exercises, and a session titled Armed Staff, Security Enhancement, or Liability. Who knows? So the Blue Moon Consulting Group is another firm that serves dozens of universities and colleges. It recently hosted its own campus unrest-themed crisis leadership retreat in Breckenridge, Colorado. So I think it's always a student journalism task right now, or just anyone who's at a university right now. If you're interested in this, if you're a pro-Palestinian person listening to this who sympathizes with the Palestinian cause, and you're at a university right now, I think it's very interesting to ask yourself, or try and find out, did someone from university attend one of these conferences, and how did they influence the policies? I think that's a very interesting kind of avenue, because it indicates how the university views the protesters and views those protesters in particular. So these gatherings help explain the uniformity of new policies recently announced on campuses, from liberal arts schools to large universities like Pomona College and the California State University System. Administrations have imposed a spate of anti-protesting guidelines, bans on encampments, temporary structures, amplified sound, chalking, freestanding signs, flyering, outdoor displays, and event tables are among measures introduced to curtail political expression. The sweeping measures close existing loopholes and preemptively stifle spontaneous and organized political activity. The University of South Florida's revised activities, signage, and usage of public space policy illustrates this move, asserting the university reserves the right to determine how to apply and interpret all time, place, and manner limitations on activities. So yeah, pretty much all these tendencies, Carnegie Mellon is another one. Expressive activity registration policy stipulates that all events involving expressive activity that deviate from the freedom of expression policy will be considered unregistered. In such cases, the administration will decide whether it is in the best interest of campus safety, security, and operations to prevent or disband the event or not, whether those involved in providing leadership or organizing and executing such unregistered event should be subject to conduct review. So essentially, it is up to the university, and they're giving themselves incredible amounts of power here in terms of ruining these kids' lives for participating in these protests. And it's, this should be a First Amendment protected right. And if you don't like the speech, that's one thing. You can discipline them within the context of the school. So, but from what we've seen, within, I think discipline for any protest should be discouraged, but I guess from a legal framework, if you're a private university and you can discipline people inside the school, that's one thing, but you are stepping up to ruin people's lives, as we've seen in the spring, for relatively tame protests, for essentially doing what they do as kids and as citizens, and this kind of, as just American citizens and people in this country. I think it is very, very depressing. It's very, very isolating to see this happen, and it shows that for all the, and we've heard so much. I think to a certain extent, I think these actions by these very uniform actions that essentially give the university, in terms of their new updated policies and guidelines, essentially unlimited control, and in terms of enforcement, in terms of what constitutes an enforceable protest, not only do they have unlimited control over that, but they also have unlimited control on how and when and in what manner they can punish people for supposedly violating their framework here, for violating their setup. And I think that that is very, very dark to think about. But I think what it also shows at the same time is that these protests matter. They make a difference. They make people in power uncomfortable, and they also force the issue. I think right after campus ended, the school ended, the debate happened. That also threw Palestine on the news. But the protests are also a very good issue, good instrument if done correctly, in terms of forcing the issue of Palestine in America, in American kind of social media. Showing these protests, forces the media to cover it, forces them to discuss what's going on the ground, the merits of the pro-Palestinian case, and it also makes these universities incredibly uncomfortable, puts them under pressure from their donors, which I think is a good thing as well. So all this stuff is very, very important. And even if you are kind of peripherally pro-Palestine out there, I'm going to make the case. If you see a protest out there on your campus, if you live near a campus that's getting really stifled, do try and contribute in any way you can, because this is crimes on top of crimes are going on a daily basis. It's just unmitigated slaughter with your tax dollars if you're a U.S. citizen. Most principally, it is. We are funding this. I'm funding this. You're funding this. We're all funding this. So if you see somebody, or if you are kind of in any way connected to a campus, support these protests. I beseech you out there, support these protests as much as you can, because they matter. They are crucial for funding these, or not for just for making sure the people of this country, the people in power in this country, don't forget about Palestine, because they want to forget. They don't want to have to think about it. They want to pass it away. They want to push it off. They just want to say, oh, don't worry, who cares? It's no big deal. But we cannot let them, and these protests are the most effective way for them to be forced to talk about Palestine, for it to remain an issue in the politics, and for people like Kamala Harris to not be able to go around and pass it off and say, oh, we're working tirelessly for a ceasefire. Don't just forget about all that stuff. Vote for us. Don't you care about abortion? No, this stuff is going on. We can't forget about it. And these protests, as much, and I think the attempts to stifle them show this, that they make people uncomfortable, that they work, and that they are essential for keeping the Palestinian issue on the front burner, not the back burner, and thus they must be supported. All right, so we got for you guys today. It's Newsflash.